They left her on the ridge with nothing but a flour sack and her father's old coat, and 10-year-old Alara Voss watched the wagon pull away without once looking back. Her mother had been dead 3 weeks. Her father 6 months before that. And now Uncle Garrett, the last blood she had in the world, had driven her 40 miles north of the mining town of Copper Falls, Montana, stopped the horses at the edge of a glacier field, and told her to get out. She remembered his exact words. "Your daddy left nothing but debts and fairy tales. I got 5 mouths of my own to feed. You're old enough to work, so go find work." She was not old enough to work. She was 10, but Garrett had already taken the house, the mule, and every cent her father had hidden in the tobacco tin behind the stove. He had taken the quilt her mother stitched by hand and the iron skillet that had crossed the plains from Missouri. He kept it all, and he left her with a sack containing a half loaf of bread, a skinning knife, and a mystery she would not understand for another 8 years. Because folded into the lining of her father's coat, sewn between the wool and the canvas with careful tiny stitches, was a map. She would not find it until the spring thaw of 1895, when she was 18 years old and had already done the impossible. She had survived 8 winters inside a glacier. But that discovery was still years away, and on this September afternoon in 1887, all Ilar knew was cold. The wind came off the Beartooth Range carrying the smell of pine resin and ice. It cut through the coat, which was 3 sizes too large, and dragged in the dirt behind her like a bridal train. The bread would last 2 days if she rationed it. The knife was dull. The nearest town was Copper Falls, 40 miles south, where everyone knew Uncle Garrett, and no one would take in a girl whose father had died owing money to half the merchants on Main Street. She did not cry. She had cried when her mother died, and it had not brought her back. She had cried when her father was crushed in the mine collapse, and it had not pulled him from the rubble. Crying was a luxury that changed nothing, and Alara Voss, at 10 years old, had already learned this. So she walked, not south toward Copper Falls, where Garrett's lies would follow her, not east toward the open prairie where there was no shelter and the first snow could come any day. She walked north, toward the glacier, because her father had once told her something strange and wonderful about ice. He had said, "Alara, a glacier is not what people think. It is not a dead thing. It breathes. It moves. And deep inside, where the ice meets the mountain, there are places where the earth itself is warm." She had been 7 when he said it. She had not understood, but now, standing at the edge of the largest ice field in the northern Rockies with nothing else in the world, she remembered, and she walked toward the ice. The glacier stretched before her like a frozen ocean, blue and white and ancient. It groaned in the wind, deep sounds that vibrated in her chest like the lowest notes of a church organ. Most people in the territory feared glaciers. They were unpredictable. Crevasses opened without warning. Ice shelves calved and fell with the force of collapsing buildings. The old trappers said you could hear a glacier dreaming at night, and those dreams were never kind. Alara walked along the eastern edge where the ice met the granite mountainside. Her father had been a miner before he came to Copper Falls, and before that, a surveyor for the Northern Pacific Railway. He knew rock. He knew how mountains were made. And he had spent 2 seasons mapping this glacier for a geological survey that never published its findings. She walked for 3 hours. The bread was already half gone because she was too hungry and too scared to ration properly. The light was failing. The temperature was dropping fast, and she could feel the cold settling into her fingers and toes with the tingling numbness that she knew even at 10 was the beginning of something dangerous. Then she found it. A crack in the mountainside where the glacier had pulled away from the rock, leaving a gap barely wide enough for a child to squeeze through. Warm air drifted from the opening, carrying the faint smell of minerals and sulfur. It was the smell of the earth's blood, her father would have said. The smell of hot springs deep underground. Alara pressed her face to the gap and felt the warmth on her skin like a hand against her cheek. In the darkness beyond she could hear water. Not the sharp dripping of snowmelt, but the slow, steady murmur of a stream running over smooth stone. She was too young to know the word geothermal. She did not know that the volcanic activity beneath Yellowstone extended in underground channels across hundreds of miles, creating pockets of heated water and warm stone even in the coldest regions of the northern Rockies. She did not know that her father had mapped these thermal vents during his survey work and had marked this exact location on the document he had hidden in his coat. All she knew was that it was warm, and she was going to die if she stayed outside. She squeezed through the gap. The rock scraped her shoulders and tore the flour sack from her hands, scattering what remained of the bread across the ground behind her. She did not go back for it. The passage narrowed, then widened, then opened into a space so unexpected that she stopped breathing for a moment. It was a cavern, not large, perhaps 30 feet across and 12 feet high, carved by centuries of glacial movement against the mountain. The floor was smooth stone, worn by water. Along the far wall, a hot spring bubbled up from a fissure in the rock, sending steam curling toward the ceiling. The air was warm, genuinely warm, at least 50 degrees, maybe more. After the bitter wind outside, it felt tropical. But the cavern was not empty. Someone had been here before. Against the west wall, she found the remains of a camp. A fire ring made of stacked stones, blackened with old soot. A rusted tin cup, a canvas tarpaulin folded neatly on a rock shelf, stiff with age but intact. And scratched into the wall above the fire ring, in letters she recognized with a shock that turned her stomach to water, were the initials J.V. Jonas Thaw, her father. He had known about this place. He had lived here, or worked here, or at the very least sheltered here during his survey years. And he had never told her, or perhaps he had tried to tell her, in his way, with his stories about glaciers that breathed and mountains that were warm inside. Alara sat on the stone floor next to the hot spring and held her hands over the steam. The warmth crept into her fingers slowly, painfully, like blood returning to a limb that had fallen asleep. She was 10 years old, alone, abandoned, with no food, no supplies, and no one in the world who cared whether she lived or died. But she was warm, and she was alive. And she was not going to leave. The first winter nearly killed her 3 times. Once from hunger, once from a rockfall near the entrance that sealed her in for 2 days before she dug herself free, and once from the loneliness, which was a kind of dying that left no marks on the body, but hollowed out the spirit like a river carving through limestone. She survived the hunger by learning to fish the hot spring. The thermal water supported a small population of sculpin, a bottom-feeding fish no bigger than her hand, bony and bland but alive with protein. She caught them with her bare hands at first, then fashioned a net from strips of the old canvas tarpaulin. The spring also grew a thick mat of algae along its edges, which she learned to eat after watching a family of pikas venture into the cavern to graze on it. The pikas became her first companions. Small, round, rabbit-like creatures with high-pitched calls that echoed off the cavern walls. They lived in the rock crevices near the entrance and seemed entirely unbothered by her presence. She named them. The largest was Boss. The smallest, with a torn ear, was Scrapper. She talked to them constantly because silence in a cave is not peaceful. It is a weight that presses on the mind until it cracks. She solved the problem of light by discovering that the glacier itself transmitted a blue glow during daylight hours. The ice above the cavern where the glacier pressed against the mountain was thin enough in places to let sunlight through, filtered and diffused into a pale blue radiance that filled the space with an otherworldly beauty. She marked the passing of days by watching this glow brighten and fade. She solved the problem of heat by expanding the hot spring. Using the skinning knife and a flat stone as a chisel, she widened the fissure in the rock, allowing more thermal water to flow into the cavern. Within weeks, the temperature rose to nearly 60 degrees. She learned to channel the overflow into shallow pools that she lined with flat stones, creating a system of radiant floor heating that pioneer families in Iceland had used for centuries, though she had never heard of Iceland and invented the technique from pure necessity. By the second winter, she had built walls. She gathered stones from the cavern floor and the passage outside, stacking them with a mixture of clay and algae that dried to a surprisingly strong morite. She created a sleeping alcove near the hot spring, a food preparation area with flat stone shelves, and a ventilation channel that directed steam and smoke through a natural crack in the ceiling. The old trappers and mountain men who had built similar shelters called this a dugout, but Elora's home was something more. It was part cave, part hot spring bathhouse, part root cellar, all the insulated by 30 feet of glacial ice that kept the temperature stable winter and summer. She learned to preserve food using techniques her mother had taught her, though she adapted them to her unusual environment. She packed sculpin in salt crystals that she scraped from mineral deposits near the spring. She dried strips of fish on heated stones. When she was brave enough to venture outside during the brief summers, she gathered berries, wild turnips, and the inner bark of lodgepole pines, which she pounded into a flour and stored in pouches made from animal hides she found cached in the rocks, left by some long-ago trapper. By the third year, she had a garden. The thermal water and the blue glacial light, which provided just enough energy for photosynthesis, allowed her to grow small crops of watercress and wild onion in shallow stone troughs. The taste of something green and growing after months of fish and algae was so overwhelming that she cried for the first time since her mother's funeral. The people of Copper Falls learned she was alive in the summer of 1890. 3 prospectors, following a rumor of gold in the glacier fields, stumbled upon the entrance to her cavern and found a 13-year-old girl, lean and brown-skinned from the mineral water, living in what they described as a stone palace inside a mountain of ice. The story spread, a wild child in the glacier, a girl raised by the mountain. The prospectors told it in saloons from Copper Falls to Billings, and each telling made her stranger, more savage, more pitiable. Some people came to gawk. They squeezed through the entrance passage and stood in her cavern with their mouths open, pointing at her stone walls and her fish pools and her watercress garden. They left trinkets sometimes, a ribbon, a tin of beans, once a Bible, which she read cover to cover 11 times, and from which she taught herself words she had never heard spoken aloud. But no one offered to take her in. She was a curiosity, not a responsibility. Uncle Garrett, when he heard, reportedly said, "If the mountain wants her, the mountain can have her." The women of Copper Falls said it was a shame but did nothing. The men said she was tough as rawhide and meant it as a compliment that absolved them of any obligation to help. So Elara stayed. She expanded her cavern. She carved new rooms from the softer stone where the thermal water had weakened the rock. She built a second entrance, higher up the mountainside, hidden behind a shelf of ice, in case the lower passage collapsed again. She tanned hides. She fashioned tools. By the time she was 15, her home had 4 rooms, a reliable food supply, and a ventilation system so effective that the air inside was fresher than the air in most cabins in Copper Falls. She was not happy. Happiness requires the presence of others, or at least the possibility of it. But she was competent, she was alive, and she had developed a knowledge of glacial geology, thermal dynamics, and cold weather survival that would have impressed the professors at any Eastern university, though none of them would ever know her name. Then came the spring of 1895. She was 18. The winter had been unusually warm, and the glacier was melting faster than she had ever seen. Water ran through her cavern in streams that had not existed before. New crevices opened in the walls. The ice above her sleeping chamber thinned until she could see the sky through it, blue and impossibly distant, like looking up from the bottom of a frozen sea. She was repairing the lower entrance when she noticed the lining of her father's coat had come apart. She had worn the coat every day for 8 years, patching and restitching it until it was more thread than original fabric. But the lining had always held, sewn with those careful tiny stitches that she now realized were not the work of a man who sewed carelessly. They were deliberate. They were meant to last. They were meant to be found. She pulled the lining apart and found the map. It was drawn on oilskin in her father's precise surveyor's hand. It showed the glacier field, the mountain, the cavern she'd been living in for 8 years, all of it labeled and measured. But it showed more, much more. Her father had mapped an entire network of thermal vents running beneath the glacier and along the eastern slope of the mountain range. He had identified 12 separate hot spring sites, each one marked with temperature readings, flow rates, and geological notations. He had mapped underground channels that connected the springs. He had found a geothermal reservoir, a vast pocket of heated water deep beneath the mountain that he estimated could provide warmth and energy for a settlement of hundreds. And at the bottom of the map, in handwriting so small she had to hold it to the glacial light to read it, he had written a note. For Ella, the railroad will come through Copper Falls within 10 years. When it does, this land will be worth everything or nothing. File the claim before Garrett finds this map. These springs are your inheritance. Your mother and I love you more than the whole world and all its mountains. He had known that Garrett would take everything. He had known that the house and the mule and the money and the tobacco tin were bait, things Garrett would grab and be satisfied with, never thinking to search the lining of an old coat. Jonas Voss had hidden his real legacy where only his daughter would find it, sewn into the one thing he knew she would never abandon. Alara sat in her cavern, the map spread across her knees, and felt something she had not felt in 8 years. She felt her father's hand on her shoulder. She heard his voice telling her about glaciers that breathe, and she understood, finally, that she had never been abandoned at all. She had been planted. She filed the claim in June of 1895, walking 40 miles to Copper Falls in her patched coat and her hand-sewn hide boots, carrying the map and the mineral survey and a sample of thermal water in a sealed tin cup. The clerk at the land office looked at her like she was a ghost. She was, in a way, the wild girl from the glacier, grown up and standing in his office with documentation that would have satisfied a federal judge. She claimed 640 acres along the eastern glacier field, encompassing all 12 thermal vents and the underground reservoir. The filing cost $1.75. She paid with coins she had found in the cavern over the years, dropped by visiting prospectors and gawkers. It was the best $1.75 ever spent in the history of Montana. Uncle Garrett heard about the claim within the week. He came to the land office red-faced and shouting, demanding to see the paperwork, insisting that anything Jonas Voss owned belonged to him as next of kin. The clerk, a quiet man named Bertram Small who had disliked Garrett for 20 years, pointed out that Garrett had publicly abandoned his niece on a mountainside at age 10, had claimed her father left nothing of value, and had never filed for guardianship or estate rights. The claim was valid. The land was Alara's. Garrett called her names in the street. He said she was a fraud, a feral creature unfit to own property. He said a woman, a girl, a cave dweller had no business filing land claims. A few men laughed along with him. Most did not, because the winter of 1895 was coming, and the old-timers could feel it. They called it the Great White Winter. It began on October 23rd with a blizzard that dropped 4 feet of snow in 16 hours. The temperature fell to 32 degrees below zero. The wind came from the north at 60 miles an hour, driving the snow sideways, packing it against doors and walls and rooftops until the weight collapsed buildings like paper boxes. Copper Falls was devastated. The general store lost its roof on the first night. The livery stable collapsed, killing 4 horses. The schoolhouse, built cheaply with green lumber the previous spring, folded inward on itself like a man clutching his stomach. The church steeple snapped and fell through the roof of the parsonage. By the 3rd day, people were burning furniture to stay warm. By the 5th day, they were burning floorboards. The wells froze. The creek froze. The pipes in the new hotel, the pride of Copper Falls, burst and flooded the ground floor, which then froze into a solid block of ice that would not fully melt until May. 17 people were dead by the end of the first week. Frostbite took fingers, toes, ears. Children cried from the cold, then stopped crying, which was worse. The doctor's office was packed wall to wall with shivering bodies, and the doctor himself had a case of pneumonia that would kill him before Christmas. And in her cavern, 30 miles north, Alara Voss was warm. The glacier insulated her home so effectively that the temperature inside never dropped below 55 degrees. The hot spring ran as steadily as ever, providing warmth, water, and food. Her watercress grew, her fish swam. Her picas, the great-grandchildren of Boss and Scrapper, squeaked and tumbled over the stones, as if the worst winter in Montana history was happening on a different planet. She did not know how bad it was in Copper Falls. Not at first. The snow sealed her lower entrance, but her upper exit, the one she had built after the rockfall years ago, opened onto a sheltered ledge above the glacier, accessible even in deep snow. She ventured out on the 8th day and saw the smoke. Not the smoke of warming fires. The black heavy smoke of a town burning its own bones. She knew then. She had seen enough winters to read the signs. The color of the sky, the absence of birdsong, the particular quality of silence that settles over the land when the cold has killed everything that makes noise. She went back into her cavern and packed. She filled a hide sack with dried fish, salt crystals, watercress, and a jar of rendered fat she kept for waterproofing leather. She rolled the map into a tight cylinder and tucked it inside her coat. Then she put on the coat, laced her boots, and walked south through the worst blizzard in a generation. It took her 2 days. She nearly died twice. Once when she broke through a snow bridge over a frozen creek and plunged into water up to her waist, and once when the wind was so strong she could not stand and had to crawl for 3 hours across an open ridge. Her hands went numb, then burned, then went numb again. She talked to herself the entire time, repeating her father's words like a prayer. A glacier breathes. The earth is warm inside. She reached Copper Falls on the afternoon of November 3rd and found a town that looked like a battlefield. Buildings leaned at drunken angles. Snow had drifted to the second-story windows of the hotel. The streets were empty except for the wind, which screamed between the buildings with a sound like tearing metal. She found people in the church, the only building still mostly intact. 47 people, huddled together under every blanket and coat and curtain in town, burning pews for warmth. They looked at her as she came through the door with the cold pouring in behind her, and she saw their faces change. Disbelief, shame, and then, in some of them, something that looked like hope. Uncle Garrett was there. He was sitting in the back row, wrapped in the quilt her mother had made, the one he had stolen 8 years ago. His feet were black with frostbite. He looked at Alara, and he looked away. She did not speak to him, not yet. She went to the front of the church, set down her sack of food, and spoke to the room. There are hot springs north of here. My father mapped them. I have lived in a cavern near the glacier for 8 years, and the temperature inside has never dropped below 55 degrees. There's warm water, shelter, and food enough for all of you if we move quickly. The walk is hard, but staying here will kill you. The cold is not breaking. Your buildings are failing. If we go now, we live. If we wait, we do not. Silence. The wind screamed outside. A child whimpered. A man named Curtis, who owned the general store and had once refused to sell Alara a tin of matches because she could not pay, said, "You expect us to follow a girl who lives in a hole in the ice?" Alara looked at him. She was 18 years old, standing straight despite 2 days of walking through a blizzard, her father's coat hanging from her shoulders like a banner. "I expect you to choose between pride and survival, Mr. Curtis. I chose survival when I was 10. It is not too late for you to do the same." They went. Not all of them, not at first. Curtis stayed behind with 6 others who could not bring themselves to follow a girl they had pitied and dismissed for nearly a decade. But 40 people followed Alara north into the storm, carrying their children and their injured and what little food they had left. The walk took 3 days. Alara broke trail through chest-deep snow, guided by landmarks she had memorized over 8 years of living in the glacier field. She showed them how to build snow shelters when they had to stop, packing the snow into blocks and stacking them in a curve to deflect the wind, a technique she had learned from watching how the glacier shaped itself against the mountain. She melted snow for drinking water using heated stones carried in hide pouches against the body, a trick her father had described in a margin note on the map. 3 people had to be carried. An elderly woman named Ruth, who had taught school in Copper Falls for 30 years. A boy of 6, whose feet were too frostbitten to walk. And Uncle Garrett, whose blackened feet had given way on the 2nd day. Alara organized teams to carry them, rotating every half-mile. She did not exempt Garrett from being carried. She did not comment on it. She simply assigned 4 men to the task and kept walking. They reached the glacier on the 5th of November. Alara led them through the upper entrance, down the passage she had carved and reinforced over years, into the cavern that glowed blue with glacial light and hummed with the warmth of the earth. 40 people stood in her home and felt the heat rise around them like an embrace. The children touched the hot spring and laughed, the first laughter any of them had produced in 2 weeks. Ruth, the old school teacher, sat on the stone bench Alara had built beside the spring, put her face in her hands and wept. They stayed for 6 weeks. Alara showed them everything: how to fish the spring, how to grow watercress, how to channel the thermal water through stone troughs for heating and cooking, how to seal the walls with clay and algae mortar, how to read the glacier's movements by the sounds it made, the deep groans that meant expansion, the sharp cracks that meant a crevice was forming nearby. She fed them, 40 people, for 6 weeks from the stores she had built over 8 years and the thermal ecosystem she had cultivated since childhood. The fish were small, the watercress was thin, and the algae tasted like wet stone. But no one went hungry, no one froze. Curtis and the 6 holdouts arrived on the 20th of November, half dead, having burned through the last of the church pews, and finally admitted that pride was a poor substitute for warmth. Alara welcomed them without comment. She gave them hot spring water to drink and watercress to eat and showed them where to sleep. Curtis, thawing by the spring with his cracked hands wrapped in wet algae poultices that Alara had made, looked at her for a long time before he spoke. "I owe you an apology, Miss Foss." "Several, probably. You owe me nothing," she said. "But you might owe your neighbors the truth. You might tell them that a hole in the ice is a better home than a fine building, if the hole is built with knowledge and the building is built with pride." The great white winter broke in late December. The survivors returned to Copper Falls to find half the town destroyed. They rebuilt, but they rebuilt differently. Alara showed them her father's map. She showed them the network of thermal vents, the underground channels, the geothermal reservoir that could warm an entire settlement. Working together, the people of Copper Falls dug channels from the nearest hot springs to the town, running heated water through stone-lined trenches beneath their new buildings. They insulated their walls with layers of packed earth and clay, the way Alara had insulated her cavern. They built root cellars that tapped into the thermal gradient, keeping food above freezing even in the deepest cold. The Northern Pacific Railroad reached Copper Falls in 1897, just as Jonas Foss had predicted. The railroad men found a town unlike any other in Montana, a town heated by the earth itself, a town that had survived the worst winter in territorial history without losing a single soul after Alara's rescue, a town that smelled faintly of sulfur and minerals, the perfume of survival. Alara never moved back to Copper Falls permanently. She kept her cavern, expanded it, improved it, and lived there in the winters when the glacier glowed blue and the hot springs sang its quiet song. But she spent her summers in town teaching. She taught the children how to read the land, how to find water, how to build shelters that worked with the earth instead of against it. She taught them the things her father had taught her without knowing he was teaching them. Uncle Garrett lost both feet to the frostbite. He lived the rest of his life in a small house at the edge of town, heated by thermal water channeled from the springs his brother had mapped. Alara paid for the house. She never discussed this, and Garrett never thanked her. But on the day he died in 1903, they found her mother's quilt folded on his porch with a note that read, in shaking handwriting, "This always belonged to you." She took the quilt back to her cavern and spread it on the stone bench beside the spring. The picas nested in its folds. The steam from the spring kept it warm. Years later, when a journalist from the Billings Gazette came to write her story, he asked Alara what she had learned from the glacier. She thought for a long time, standing at the entrance to her cavern with the ice field stretching before her and the warmth at her back. "The mountain does not care if you are strong or weak," she said. "It does not care if you are right or wrong. It only asks one question. Can you listen? The cold will tell you where the warmth is, if you stop fighting it long enough to hear. Every hardship has a door in it. My father knew that. He left me the map, but the glacier taught me how to read it." The journalist wrote it down. The quote appeared in newspapers from Montana to New York. People clipped it and pinned it to their kitchen walls, next to almanac pages and Bible verses and pictures of loved ones gone. But Alara did not read the newspapers. She was in her cavern, tending the spring growing watercress in the blue glacial light, listening to the mountain breathe. She was home. She had always been home. It just took her a long time and a very hard road to understand that home is not the place you are given. It is the place you carve from the rock when the world leaves you with nothing else. And the glacier kept breathing. And the earth stayed warm. And the map, pinned to the cavern wall above the fire ring, next to her father's initials, pointed to a future that Jonas Voss had seen and his daughter had built. One stone, one season, one stubborn act of survival at a time.